Okay, hi everyone. This is the final Prospect Weekly Roundup of the year. I'm David Dayen, Executive Editor, and we have an innovation here for the last one of the year. We pre-taped the Prospect Weekly Roundup. Earlier in the week, the Prospect was pleased to run an essay from President Joe Biden about his economic agenda, his accomplishments, and what it means for the future, explaining not just what happened, but why he did what he did. And I thought it would be good to talk to someone who was intimately involved with those decisions during the Biden term. So I called up Bharat Ramamurthy. He was the deputy director of the National Economic Council from 2021 to 2023, and decided to have a conversation with him about the essay and about the accomplishments of the Biden era, whether they will endure, where things might have gone wrong, where things went right, and what the thought process was behind everything. So you're going to watch that now. It's about the size of a weekly roundup. It's about an hour, a little less than an hour. And after that, I'll come back and have a few things. Just before I do that, a couple quick things. This is, as I said, our last one of the year. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be off for the roundup and then back in January. It's our end of the year fundraising campaign. If you appreciate the work we do about ideas, politics, and power, you can go to prospect.org/donate and help us out. And I'll be back at the end with a little bit more for you. So let's get that going right now. It's myself and Bharat Ramamurthy. Here you go. Well, let me introduce Bharat Ramamurthy. He was the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council for Manufacturing, Innovation, and Domestic Competitiveness from 2021 to 2023. Thanks for being here and talking to me about this essay.
Sure.
First of all, maybe we could just get sort of your top level thoughts about it, and did you recognize it as conveying, the not just the record that you were associated with, but the thought process behind it?
Yeah, I thought the essay did a good job of ticking through the major economic accomplishments of the Biden administration. I think situating it in a couple of different ways. Number one, amidst a period of global economic turmoil coming out of COVID, right? It's important to remember that in January 2021, when the president took office, the unemployment rate was well over 6%. Job growth had been slowing over the past few months before he had taken office. Less than 1% of the country was vaccinated. I know it's hard for people to remember that. And there was a ton of uncertainty about what the recovery would look like, what the public health situation would look like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now, what other countries would do to reopen after COVID. And so within all of that economic uncertainty, the president clearly prioritized, as he says in his essay, a speedy recovery back to a full employment situation, and making some long-term investments in American manufacturing, in domestic productivity, alongside an emphasis on promoting competition across different markets. And I think, as his essay does a good job of explaining, number one, it did help produce what I think is a consensus view is the world's strongest economic recovery. But a
Yeah.
lot of what he put in place isn't going to be felt for, in some case, 3, 5, 10 years. And so when evaluating the economic legacy of this administration, it's important to have that kind of long-term view, because some of these things are going to pay off in 2030 or 2035.
Yeah, I want to get into all of that, but I want to start by taking me back to those early stages. I think you just said something really important that I think people forget. Yes, unemployment was at 6%. It wasn't at 15% like it was the very beginning of COVID, but the recovery was stalling out. over that sort of November, December, January period, mainly because a lot of the CARES Act spending had ended. There was another recovery act that was put together, Consolidated Budget Appropriations Act or something like that. I forget the exact name, but in December of 2024, there was some more spending, but it hadn't yet, hit people's wallets, and it hadn't gone forward. And so you're sitting there at the very beginning, during the transition, the beginning of the administration, saying, there needs to be a big stimulus, even though there was this one that was coming down the pike. Do you feel the administration has been vindicated on that strategy? Because there was a lot of talk that, okay, this is what helped trigger the higher inflation. This was too expansive, maybe on the state government side, or on, maybe around certain other aspects of it. Do you feel like it, looking back in hindsight 4 years later, that it was the right sort of level and targeted in the right way?
Yeah. Look, my view is that with the benefit of hindsight, there are several things that we can and should have done differently. But one of them is not the American Rescue Plan and the approach we took early in the administration to make sure the economy got back on track. I mean, I think it's important to remember that in January of 2021, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan organization, did a projection of economic trends. And what they projected was that because of the slowing recovery, we would get back as a country to sub 4% unemployment in 2024, right? So it would take 3 years to get back to that level. And if you look at the
and was that trajectory including the December 2020 bill?
So,
okay.
The issue was we were looking at a kind of grinding recovery to get from 6.5% unemployment back down to what people would consider full employment, meaning right, roughly 3.5, 4-ish%. And we had serious concerns about the economic implications of that. That would basically consign millions of additional people to long-term unemployment, which is particularly harmful for those people's career. It basically has lifelong implications for earnings, for career trajectory. By the way, that would be disproportionately Black and Hispanic folks because the unemployment rate was higher in those communities at that time. And it meant harm for all workers. I mean, this is the thing that I want to try to emphasize, is that when people say, unemployment is a little bit less important because it only helps those 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people who go from being unemployed to employed. What's the difference between 6% and 4% unemployment? Oh, it's just, a dozen million people getting jobs, right? But having that tight labor market where there is intense competition among employers for jobs is the basis for wage growth across the income spectrum.
Right.
And so we wanted workers of all types, not just those who are currently unemployed, to benefit from a tighter labor market. And so getting back to that 4% target more quickly was a real priority, and we did. And the other thing to remember is that I talked a little bit at the beginning about uncertainty. We wanted to make sure that people had enough to get through whatever ups and downs may come in the year and a half to come.
Right.
Because historically, it's hard to go back to Congress and say, give us more stimulus, give us more relief. Right? You often get one bite at the apple. That's what we saw in the Obama administration. That's what we had seen in previous recoveries. And so we wanted to make sure that people had a cushion. And guess what? You had the Delta variant, which really knocked the labor market down. You had the Omicron variant, which led to a huge bump in the labor market in 2021. And then you had the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which led to massive global economic disruptions. It led the price of gas to go up to $5, $6 a gallon in the United States. It raised the price of food. Through all of that, we came out the other side with 2 years of extremely low unemployment and wages rising across the income spectrum. And if you look at what happened in other countries where they were less generous with the relief on the front end, they got all the same amount of inflation as the United States did. They just got a lot less growth and wage growth. And so people were far worse off at the end of it.
Yeah, all of that is compelling to me. The critique that maybe makes a little more sense to me is the fact that the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, was all temporary spending. So this dynamic ends up being created where a pop-up safety net began because of the pandemic, began in the CARES Act under Trump, and then ends under Biden. Now, that doesn't say who actually was responsible for passing things, who was responsible for ending things, which we know, Republicans were responsible, particularly around things like the child tax credit. Uh, but the low information voter gets the information that I was getting checks, I was getting unemployment boost, I was getting the ability to go on Medicaid, increased food stamp production, rental assistance. All that ends, and it ends pretty much at the same time that inflation spikes. And so, how big a problem was that from your view? And was it avoidable? Because it's not like we were going to keep giving checks forever. I understand that. So, what was the way that dynamic, which I think it's compelling to me that did create an impact.
Yeah,
How could that have been avoided?
um, I think it is a contributor to some of the political fallout we've seen over the last 4 years. I don't want to say it's the only thing,
Sure.
but I think um, it is important to recognize that not even low information voters, which is a term that I don't. It's hard to define. Just regular
Right.
people who don't obsessively
Right.
follow politics, probably what they experienced, as you said, was um, the massive disruption of COVID in 2020, a surge of relief from the government in 2020, and then again in 2021 under the Biden administration, and then
Mm-hmm.
kind of a winnowing away of that in 2022 and 2023. Now, if you just look at it mechanically from how much income did these people have? How many did they build up savings during COVID, which they were then able to spend down in the subsequent period, allowing them to basically let their wages catch up and therefore, overall improve their financial condition. All of that suggests that that worked out pretty well for most people. But,
Yeah.
you can't, people don't live life on spreadsheets. They are going to experience um, the fact that student loan payments were paused under the Trump administration and they resumed under the Biden administration. And
Correct.
that's 45 million adults. And for many of
Right.
them, student loan payments is one of their main interactions with the federal government, right? 45 million people experienced a financial burden stopping under Trump and then restarting under Biden. We obviously tried to do something about that. We had a big debt relief plan, which was intended to address the fact that restarting payments would impose a significant burden on a big chunk of borrowers. And so we wanted to provide relief to that set of
Right.
borrowers at the same time that we turned the payments back on. Of course, that was blocked by the Supreme Court. So on that one, we tried to do something about it. But on many other cases, we I'll be honest, I think that there was a view that we have facilitated a transition away from these temporary supports because we have seen this economic growth. And
Right.
we've basically replaced the temporary government assistance with bigger paychecks and a higher stock market and other things, rising home prices and bigger home equity and we've therefore, solved the puzzle. And I just think that that wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily the right way of looking at things. And of course, there was a political
Yeah.
cost to the fact that for especially low income people who benefited from a temporary expansion of Medicaid, right? An expansion of the rules of Medicaid, who benefited from foreclosure and eviction moratorium, who benefited from a student loan pause, who benefited from, the child tax credit payments in 2021. All of that went away. And of course, that had a financial impact on people.
And I think that analysis is right because the people who benefited from that temporary safety net are not the same people who benefited necessarily from the ongoing improved economic circumstances. And it's interesting. I mean, you wrote this reflection of things that you saw, sort of contributing to this sort of post-election debate. And you point out that Democrats did better than like any other incumbent party across the world in 2024. The punchline of that being that every incumbent party lost. So better is not necessarily good enough. But you attribute this in part to economic performance, but what we're talking about here kind of it aligns with the fact that Democrats lost voters who make less than $100,000 a year for the first time. And, I think some of the other stuff, I think the economic performance that we had may have been beneficial to those over that threshold. And also somewhat of an artifact of, historical Democratic success in presidential races. 7 of the previous 8 presidential elections where Democrats won the popular vote, right? But it's I think you're seeing some compositional shifts there to account for that better performance. But overall, I think that you get at something there, that the effect of removing that safety net is not the same, and it's not the same population as the effect of increased economic growth.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say 2 things. Number one, if you look at economic performance, right, especially wages, the data shows that the wage growth was actually the highest at the lowest.
Well, that's true,
right? And so actually, it's interesting.
In large part because of state minimum wage increases, right? I mean,
Sure,
that had
but
a lot
also
to
I
do with
think
it.
that when you have a tight labor market, when you had 3.5%
Sure.
unemployment for about a year, that
Right.
high pressure market leads to, all of a sudden working at Chick-fil-A, you're getting $18 an hour, right? And
Right.
that means that the retail store is going to have to pay $19 an hour to attract workers. And you saw this kind of benefit across the lower end of the income spectrum. So I know
All this great reshuffling stuff,
yeah,
the people
I don't want
moving up
to.
for jobs.
I don't think we should overlook that. Yes, it's the case
Yeah.
that some of the other benefits that we saw, like a growing stock market, like a big appreciation in home price values. Yes, a lot of that accrued to higher income households, though,
Right.
65% of American households are homeowners. A little bit over 50% of American households have stocks and have stock market shares, and so that's relatively widespread gains. But the key point that you're making is that there's a whole bunch of people who are not in the labor market at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you focus on improving labor market conditions, you are doing a lot for a lot of people, including a lot of low income, more vulnerable people, people with disabilities, etc. But you are still not reaching a big chunk of the population. And for that chunk of the population, the safety net stuff that happened in 2020 and 2021, expanded Medicaid, child tax credit going to anybody with a child, regardless of whether they had income, right? The foreclosure moratorium, eviction moratorium, all of those things were beneficial to that group.
Yeah.
And we were able to do relatively little for that set of folks. And as I said in that reflections piece that you mentioned, part of me thinks that the right approach post passing the American Rescue Plan was to sort of meet voters where they are and meet the economic conditions where they are, and say, we actually have to focus. This is good policy that helps a lot of people, but also to really avoid downside risk politically, we should be focused on trying to permanently expand some of these provisions that are currently helping people, right?
Yeah.
So they experience less of a disruption in their lives. And look, it's good in the long term for us to make Medicaid more generous. It's good for us in the long term to have stronger protections in place to help people looking at potentially losing their home or being evicted. It's good for us in the long term to have some sort of solution to the fact that 30% of student loan borrowers are in default, and and others are struggling to make monthly payments. So we should do something about that set of folks. So there was, as you well know, there's this pent up energy in 2021 saying, hey, finally Democrats have control of both houses of Congress and the White House. There's
Yeah.
there's a list of things that we've wanted to do for so long. We want to build more homes. We want to deal with childcare affordability. We want to have paid family leave. We want to have universal pre-K. All of these things are great things. I want to be clear. But voters at that moment were saying, can you please do something to help us with the cost of living right now?
Right.
They weren't saying, can you please pass some of these other agenda items? And I think it's always dangerous for politicians to do what they want to do rather than what voters want them to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You get at a few things there that I want to get into. So the first, I think, is prioritization. Build Back Better was kind of structured very broadly as this laundry list, right? We're going to give a little something to everybody and that's what's going to keep this coalition together, which is somewhat fractious because this guy's going to want to stay in it because of housing, and this lady's going to want to stay in it because of universal pre-K, and et cetera, et cetera. And what that ended up doing is not only did it make it hard to untangle, but it meant that the untangling was going to happen on the back end because of one person named Joe Manchin, who became sort of the face of the Democratic Party for 15 months,
right.
Which I think was a bad idea because he was just the loudest messenger and he was the one that was picking and choosing because he was the hinge point, the tipping point vote. He was the one that was doing that prioritization for the party. So, I think what you're saying there is the prioritization should have come on the front end rather than on the back end in a painful way because of Joe Manchin.
Yeah, and look, we live in the real world where politics is hard,
Yeah.
and we were dealing with literally a 50-50 Senate where every single member was the deciding vote, right? In a world where Republicans were not going to be interested in working with us on any of these things, and
Right.
in a relatively narrow majority in the House on top of that. And so, as you said, it's very standard political coalition management to say, these 40 people really care about childcare, and these 40 people care about housing, and these 40 people care about paid family leave, and
Right.
we got to do all of them. Now, what we ended up with was and at the same time, you had a lot of pressure constricting down the size of the overall package, right? Because people were
Right.
saying, we want to offset the entire cost of it, and so we're not comfortable with doing 1 trillion, 1.5 trillion, $2 trillion in new taxes on the rich and big corporations in order to offset the cost of it. So that means you're going to have less money to invest on the front end. I think what ended up happening in the House was that they passed a pretty large bill, but it did a lot of this stuff for a few years. Even though I think you would have to admit it didn't make sense to do a lot of these things for a few years, right? If you're saying let's create a new federal state partnership to do childcare affordability and we'll fund it for 3 years, what kind of state is going to say we're going to invest a bunch of money in the front end on a program that may disappear in 3 years and it's going to take us 1.5 years to set it up, right?
Right.
We'll do universal pre-K for 4 years. Well, that's not how states don't operate that way, and I think it resulted.
That was the way to shoehorn it all in,
right.
because there was this cost cap that was put on the bill. And also you had sort of Sinema and Manchin operating at cross purposes, one of them saying the spending has to be lower and we can tax it out, and the other saying, no, we can't do those taxes. So you had a lot of things that you were juggling. But yeah, the way around that the House did was, to temporarily put these things in. So I think permanent versus temporary is one framing. But another framing that I think you get to is long-term versus short-term. I mean, so these infrastructure and climate investments that eventually got done are long-term by their very nature. The drug price negotiation was long-term by design, and I can see you shaking your head because it was a flawed design. Even the president says in this essay that we ran at the Prospect, it will take time for the full scope of the investments to take root. And that is understandable, but in a democracy, things that take time aren't going to be the things that get you any kind of political benefit. So how much should that have played into your analysis?
It's a huge part of it. And look, I would just say there are there are economic moments where maybe you can get away with a little bit of a longer term focus, right? If we were cruising along at 2% inflation and 4.5% unemployment, and we could make the case to the public, we have an opportunity now to make some investments in the long term. The economy is in good shape. I want to be clear with you, some of these things are going to take a while to pay off, but I am assuring you that 20, 30, 40 years from now, we will look back and we'll be glad that, we connected every single household in the United States to high-speed internet service. It's going to take 6, 7 years, but it's a good thing.
Right.
2021 and 2022 was not a hospitable time to make that argument, because people's hair was on fire about the cost of living. And, every single survey and poll was saying, we're happy. We recognize that there are some good things happening in the economy, but we cannot stand the fact that it's $5 a gallon at the gas station, and that the price of bacon and eggs has gone up, and that my rent has gone up 20% in the last year. Can't stand it. And they were basically, insisting that we do something about it. And I think it was hard to then respond to that with a series of almost entirely long-term proposals. All of these things are really good. Like, I want to be clear that climate stuff in particular was extremely necessary in order to do it now, because it takes time for the benefits and the emissions reduction from the clean energy investment to bear fruit, and it needs to happen now. But some of it was the design of the proposal. I said in that piece, I think there's an argument for saying we should have made Build Back Better into, number one, extending as much as we could a lot of the temporary safety net provisions that were in place in 2021, and then trying to do some targeted things on housing and on groceries in particular, which were key pain points for people. But, look, reducing the price of prescription drugs is like, baseball and apple pie. Like, it's one of the most popular things that exists in politics. It's like 90% approval. We actually did something incredible and allowed Medicare to negotiate down the price of prescription drugs, and we put in place a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap on what anybody on Medicare has to pay for prescription drugs. These are incredibly beneficial, incredibly popular things. They go into place in 2025 and beyond. I mean, it drives me insane.
I was tearing my hair out at the time. Yeah.
I'm already like bracing myself for the poll that I will see in 9 months that says, how do you feel about the new cap on Medicare out-of-pocket spending? And it'll be like, 90% approve. And it'll be like, who do you credit for this? And it'll be like 80% Trump. 20% Biden.
Because it happened on his watch. It's just very clear.
It is.
Now, to be fair to what you guys did, there were some things that you did to lower costs. The president talks about them in his essay. He talks about the use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to stabilize gas prices. He talks about a series of attacks on junk fees. I've always sort of had the sense, it's bad enough to say we did something, it happens in the future, and the future president takes credit for it. But I had the sense that people didn't know about the areas where the administration was fighting for the little guy at the time. So what do you think about that aspect of it, that there was a communications problem?
Yeah, look, it is hard to get attention, period. There's a lot of competing sources for your attention. And the question of how you break through with policy is a hard one. So, I don't think it's I don't want to sit here and make it seem like the answers were obvious and people made simple mistakes. My view has always been that conflict drives attention in politics, and that in many ways Democrats shy away from conflict because they think the ideal policy will be a win-win-win where everybody's happy, and that will translate into popularity. First of all, I don't agree that that's correct. But second of all, it's like if the tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, it fall down. Like if you have a policy that polls at 80% approval, but only 15% of the public knows about it, I would argue that that's worse than a policy that polls at 55% approval that 80% of people have heard about, right? And
Right.
so, on junk fees, there was an incredible amount of work that the administration did on airline refunds, on compensation for your flight being delayed or canceled, for your bag being lost, for your Wi-Fi not working. There was work that we did, via the FTC, for in the ticketing space. There's work that we did on a lot of work in the banking space, and I think that there were potentially missed opportunities to highlight that work by expressing it more as a conflict, right?
Right.
And to be more explicit about how we were taking on big corporate interests that were using these things to make money off of people. And then as a lot of these things got challenged in court, to go on and say, I don't know how many people know the fact that there was a cap on credit card late fees that would have been in effect right now, were it not for the fact that a bunch of financial interests went to a Trump appointee and got it enjoined. I don't know how many people know that there would be a ban on non-compete agreements and employment contracts, which benefits tens of millions of people right now, had it not been for the fact that business lobbyists went to a Trump appointee and got it enjoined. There's an opportunity to connect the dots.
What you're saying is people should read the prospect, because all that stuff was articulated very clearly.
But the point is that, and here I don't want to make it sound like Donald Trump is a political genius, but he does have a knack for generating conflict and attention in a way that highlights his core position.
Right.
And
yeah, sure.
And sometimes that involves saying sensational things. But I think that a lot of the public, first of all, the press covers things when there's a conflict for them to report on, and number two, I think that the public intuits your seriousness and commitment to making reform from who is angry at you at that moment. Right? Yeah. Because I think politicians are full of hot air. They say lots of stuff, but I really believe Donald Trump wants to do something about immigrants, because there's a ton of people who are constantly mad about the things that he's saying about immigrants. Right.
Right.
There was a world.
I think two things there that come through is the need for storytelling that has clear lines to it, and the real problem of conflict aversion in the Democratic Party, which has resonance in money in politics, has resonance in who advisors are and things like that. So, but I want to go back, because you said something I think that was pretty important that we shouldn't overlook, which is that yes, you can say that short-term priorities have to take precedence politically over long-term goals. But if you never get the long-term goals started, then you're never going to get to that place. And sometimes those things are just as urgent. And that's, the reshoring of critical industries, trying to get a foothold back in advanced manufacturing, and beginning the energy transition are just those kinds of things, where we have, manufacturing construction at an all-time high. That we've never seen before. But manufacturing construction necessarily means the plant isn't built yet, and it's not producing goods, and it's not at the level that it's going to be down the road. So Biden talks about these in the speech, and I think this was a key lesson from the pandemic supply chain crunch, that we need to be in control of more of the goods that we provide. And but I want to talk about one piece of that, because he makes very clear in the essay that he consciously focused on places that were neglected, that were left behind in the past, even if those places were populated by people opposed to his party. And this is a big understanding now, that 80% of the investments, 75% of the investments that have been made we're in red areas. Do you think that in our polarized political environment that you can really turn around communities politically by doing this? And should that be the real focus rather than a focus on, uplifting growth wherever you can, particularly in places that have been abandoned?
Yeah. A few thoughts. Number one, I think that there's definitely value in making sure that when you do a big investment plan, a big investment agenda, that the money is being invested in different areas across the country and not just concentrated on the coasts or pre-existing the Research Triangle in North Carolina or whatever, right? You want to make sure that you are there's real value in having at least pockets of this in you know in Iowa, in Missouri, and in the Deep South, and in New Mexico, and so on. Um, Aside from any political value, it's about having a country where there's opportunity available for people wherever they might live, and they can take
Mm-hmm.
advantage of that opportunity without having to leave behind their community, their family, and so on. I think that the political benefit of doing it, to me, is questionable. In other words, do I think that
Mm-hmm.
because there has been a massive influx in investment to certain parts of Georgia, and there's big battery plants coming up in Georgia and West Virginia, that those areas are going to say, um, I'm voting Democrat now because
Right.
were it not for the Inflation Reduction Act, this wouldn't have happened. I really doubt it. Again, most people don't follow politics that closely. They may think it's something that the
Right.
governor did, who's a Republican, right? They may think it's something that the company did, and they'll credit Hyundai or Nissan or whatever
Right.
for doing the
Right.
investment.
Yes.
And so, there are, um, uh, I think that we should evaluate the benefit of this program substantively and also from the perspective that it's good to have a country where there's opportunities available in a variety of different places. But I'm not deluding myself into thinking that all of a sudden upstate Georgia is going to turn into a Democratic oasis because there's been a huge amount of investment in that particular community. It
Mm-hmm.
does matter in this one case though, which is, do I think that the representatives who are Republicans who in these areas are now going to be more willing to defend the credits and investment package that made it possible? Yes, I do. And that's
Yeah.
important for durability for this agenda, which is a big part of it, right? Because you
I,
can't
I d-
have a short, if
yeah.
you have a 2-year investment, you got to have a 10-year
Yeah.
program to actually make it work.
I definitely want to talk about that later, but I want to get to a couple other things before then. And I want to start by talking about the labor agenda. So there's a whole workforce element to the things that you did. There was at least a little bit of criticism that you were trying to put on top of these investments, these conditions, this everything bagel critique. Things like registered apprenticeships, you get bonuses on the tax credits for that. Trying to build unionization or union neutrality into these investments. I want you to talk about how successful you think that element of it has been in terms of forwarding a stronger labor agenda.
It's been huge. I mean, just today there was an announcement that UAW and Rivian formed and had an agreement for neutrality for Rivian,
Mm,
and that was as a precondition of getting a big bump in funding from the federal government. So
hmm
you've seen similar types of announcements across the country. And I think that this idea that um, you can't put too many conditions on the public dollars that go out without diluting the original purpose of it, I think it's pretty overstated, right?
hmm
And I think if the goal is to create a long-lasting investment in high quality, high road jobs in the United States, like we're not trying to, you know, uh, beat Southeast Asia when it comes to, labor by having lower labor standards and therefore lower cost of
Right.
production, right? We want to have a sustainable, innovative, high quality domestic production in a number of different strategically important areas. And so, the one example that gets called out a lot by the right is as part of the CHIPS Act, which was about investments in domestic
Hmm.
microprocessor production, there was a requirement that people who are companies that are submitting for federal dollars have to explain how they intend to provide childcare,
Right.
for workers at that facility. People went nuts and they say, this social engineering, whatever. It's first of all, we need to attract more workers into this industry, and for a big chunk of workers, uh, not just female, but I guess disproportionately female, the question of is there a place that I can get affordable childcare so I can do this job and make it financially viable is a big question. So it's about making sure that there is, the right kind of labor force available to fill the necessary jobs. Same thing with
Yeah.
some of the unionization requirements. It's not just a belief. There's tons of data to show that unionized workforces produce higher quality products that's more sustainable over time. That's the thing that we want to come out at the end of all of this. And so,
Yeah.
ultimately, this is about it's not ancillary to the goal. It is, actually a key part of the goal, and that's what I think people miss about it.
And I think, if this was a problem, the first place you would have seen it is in a lower take up of the tax credits and the investments and the private capital itself. And we've seen exactly the opposite. So the companies who ultimately make these decisions were clearly not fazed by these various conditions. Or we wouldn't see, $1 trillion in investment that we're on the way to.
Yeah,
So I think that's a key point.
yeah,
Um, I want to also get into the policy part of this because people tend, I think, to see this as an appendage and not sort of part of the overall agenda. They see it as this side issue that these few odd agencies are taking on. The linkages that you have between competition policy and better outcomes for workers, the linkages with ensuring that these investments in the economy are not stunting innovation, they're not muscling out competition, they're not making prices higher. How do you see that as more cohesive than this is just the weird antitrust guys off to the side?
yeah. No, it's all it all works together, right? Number one, even apart from the broader investment agenda and all of that, there's a serious problem over the last 20 or 30 years where growing consolidation in a lot of industries has raised prices, it's lowered wages for workers, it's affected innovation because companies that feel insulated from competition have to invest fewer research and development dollars in innovation. They feel less pressure to come up with new and interesting things. And so it's really an underpinning of faster economic growth and entrepreneurship, and two things that are very important to U.S. economic performance over time. But the other thing is that it's really critical to think about how these markets that you are potentially creating are going to be structured. And I guess I would just use the example of, I know you all have written about this. Um, there was a bunch of money in the infrastructure bill for building out an EV charger network, right? And because of the focus on competition within the government, and from the president, the way that those rules were written said that basically, if you're going to get federal dollars to build out EV chargers, you basically have to make it open access, right? Your charger has to work with different types of electric vehicles,
Right.
and Tesla ended up taking money from the program, and as a result, converted its network into open access chargers. It's a huge deal for making it easier to travel across the country in an electric vehicle, and so you basically completely changed how the EV charger market works because of that focus on competition. And then, appropriately, it's going to lead to more competition in a good way in the EV network, in the EV, no, the EV market,
Right.
because now it will be which EV offers you, better mileage and better performance rather than which one has the better network, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so there's all of these downstream effects from competition that are incredibly healthy for the U.S. economy, incredibly beneficial for consumers, but also for small businesses and entrepreneurs. And this is another one where I think a lot of the benefits are going to come in the longer term, right? Where
Right.
you can't. I've always described it as an ocean liner that's been steaming in one direction for the last 30 years. We wanted to start steaming in the other direction, but you can't just throw it in reverse and have it, accelerate backwards right away. You kind of have to turn it around. And I think we've been turning it around, and I think we're going to see a lot of payoff from that in different parts of the agenda.
Well, let's talk about that longer term because, in a month's time, we're going to have a different president with a very different view on things. I've seen a lot of people ask uh, former, current government officials, how secure do you think these investments will be and these various parts of the agenda will be in the Trump years? And usually, I get a variant on what you said earlier that, hey, a lot of these investments are in red areas, and those Republican representatives are going to be, a little wary of cutting off things that are benefits to their own communities. And I agree with that. But that's not true of every single thing in the agenda. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the EV rebates are going to go away. And, the EV magnet who is the co-president right now, I think has this belief that if I pull up the ladder now, I'm equipped to continue doing running my business, and these other companies that rely more on the $7,500 rebate are going to not be able to compete with me. So there's a whole competition policy part of that too. Maybe give us a sense of where you think the continuity will continue, and where you think there may be some differences.
Yeah, I would say that the things we were able to get done legislatively, I would say that they're in the vast majority, 90+% of cases, I think that there will be continuity. And the reason for that is, number one, many of these things are extremely popular. And number two, it's just hard to pass a repeal of a law, right? I mean, like the best example I can give of that is the Republican Party organized itself around the idea that we should repeal Obamacare. Basically, that was the animating force of the Republican Party. And then when they had an opportunity to do it in 2017, they weren't able to get the votes for it because it's hard to vote to take something away from people that they're already relying on. And so that gives me some confidence that, for example, the requirement that Medicare negotiate prescription drug prices, I would bet that would continue because it's going to be awfully hard for people to come in there and take away something that's so valuable for seniors, that is good for the federal budget. And
then practically speaking, right, it would cost money if they did it. Exactly. And they're trying to get all these tax cuts giveaway. They can't handle something that's going to cost money beyond the tax cuts. They need things that will save money. But a lot of those Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act investments would save money. And there are things that are out there that they can use to offset tax cuts for billionaires.
Yeah. Again, I think that these things have built up a constituency within certain pockets of the Republican Party and also among the business community, right? The EV or the IRA energy credits, the CHIPS Act, certainly, and given the very narrow margins that Republicans are operating with, I would wager that a lot of that survives, contact with the political process. Now, the administrative stuff I'm more concerned about because you can just, with the right personnel in place, the CFPB, the FTC, wherever, you can, either stop a rule that's already in process, or you can go through the rulemaking process again to repeal a rule that has gone into effect. A lot of the stuff is under litigation. You can basically, concede on the litigation in effect.
Right. Stop fighting.
To basically go down because of a legal challenge. So this is obvious, but it's always more durable to do things legislatively than administratively.
Sure.
Even on the administrative side, there are going to have to be some prioritization on the Republican side about which ones of these things they want to dedicate their time to try to change or repeal. And if you look at Trump term one, they were able to get to some stuff, but not all of it from the Obama administration. I suspect it will be the same in Trump term two. I think that the real lesson is that from administration to administration, there's a lot of carryover, and that the default, I would say, is that the things that are passed in one administration carry on into the next administration, and the exception is that there's actually a reversal of something that had just been passed.
Great. Just to wrap up here, I mean, I think something that Biden does in this essay is he really tries to lay down a marker and set a contrast for the future. Say, this is what I did, and some of this is long term, but we're at an inflection point. If we carry it through, we're going to see better times ahead. If we don't, there's just letting you all know this is what I did, and here's who to blame if it all goes awry. Do you think that we have a mature enough political system to really pin that down and make sure that this record is understood and by people, and that in the expected credit taking to come, given Trump's propensity to airbrush out the bad stuff and take credit for the good stuff, do you really think that these kinds of things where you lay down this marker, can they be politically potent?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it's important to think about it and from different perspectives, in the sense, if there's a historical perspective, if somebody's writing 10, 20 years from now about the Biden administration, excuse me, I think that pieces like this do a good job of laying out why Biden and his team should get credit for a lot of these things. Do I think that if there's a big surge in private investment in 2025, or that all of the investments in manufacturing that are happening right now lead to a bunch of new factories opening in 2025 and 2026, if Trump goes to a ribbon cutting for a sparkling new factory in Ohio in 2026, are people going to say that's actually because of Biden? I doubt it. I just trying to be realistic. I doubt it. But will the history books acknowledge that it was Biden that created the preconditions for those things to happen? And if we look back 10, 15 years from now and say, who connected every household in the United States to high-speed internet? Joe Biden will get the credit for that, as he should. And even though a lot of those connections are going to end up happening under Trump, as long as that money is maintained. So it's a matter of perspective, and I do think that with the benefit of a little bit of time, that people will look back and say this really was a remarkably strong recovery by historical standards in the United States, and there really was a very productive legislative agenda, despite very narrow margins, that set the conditions for economic growth and prosperity in the United States. I go back to the broadband example. Connecting 20 million households to high-speed internet, it's a project it's similar in scale to the Rural Electrification Act that FDR did. And people still read about that in the history books as a critical moment for bringing economic prosperity to big parts of rural America. I think that the broadband stuff is going to be similar in terms of its impact, and I think with the benefit of a little bit of perspective, Biden will get the credit for things like that.
Well, I'll have to bring you on in 20 years, and we'll talk about this again on the exact same YouTube show that I'm sure I'm going to be doing. Bharat Ramamurthy, I want to thank you for coming on, especially as you're recovering from an Achilles injury. I had you captive, basically. You couldn't walk away if I did a question that was difficult to answer. So anyway, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, we are back. That was great. I once again invite you to read our, the president's essay that we ran this week. that there's actually a short URL for it. It's prospect.org/Biden middle out. So it's very easy to remember. As I mentioned, this is our last weekly roundup of the year, but I didn't want it to go by without acknowledging the terrible tragedy that we experienced at the Prospect this week. We learned that our writing fellow, Janie Akere, passed away. She was 2 weeks shy of her 26th birthday, and it was came as a complete shock to us. We knew that, or at least I knew that she had some medical history, but nothing like this. Nothing would have prepared me for this. We the family had run a GoFundMe for burial expenses, and we ended up yeah, they reached their goal, and we donated to that. And I want to thank everybody who read our obituary for Janie and contributed to that memorial. We're really going to miss her, and it's going to take a while for this shock to wear off. But you know, uh, we'll still have memory of Janie. She was someone who the journalism industry really should be bringing in. She was, the daughter of first generation Nigerian immigrants. She didn't come from the same social circles as a lot of journalists these days. She had a passion for telling stories about underrepresented communities because that's where she came from. And she was on her way to a really bright future, and it's just terribly tragic. I wanted to acknowledge that on this final weekly roundup of the year. We will be back in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, we're going to have best of 2024 up all this week and next at prospect.org. So you can check out some of our favorite stories of the year picked by the people who wrote them. And we will be back in 2025. Obviously, we're seeing the craziness begin with this looming potential government shutdown that is going on right now. And we've written a lot of articles at prospect.org about that you can read about why this is happening, about who's benefiting and things like that. And obviously the role of Elon Musk. So you can visit prospect.org and check that out. And we will have this conversation with me and Bharat Ramamurthy up at the site. Finally, it's our year-end fundraiser. If you appreciate this work, if you like what we did this year, you can check us out and help support us at prospect.org/donate. We try to keep overhead expenses so low that all the money that you donate goes to the production of articles, what you see on screen and what you see in the print magazine that we do 6 times a year. All of that is the result of your support. And so we'd be honored if you were to give that in this holiday season. So thank you. And we'll be back again after the first week of January. So a couple weeks off, but have a great